The film opens deep in ancient Egypt, around 360 BC, where crowds line the Nile Valley chanting the name En-Saba-Nur, a godlike mutant revered as more than human. Surrounded by devoted followers, he is carried toward a towering pyramid alongside his feared four horsemen: pestilence, famine, war, and death. Inside the structure, an elaborate ceremony is being prepared. The goal is terrifying. En-Saba-Nur plans to transfer his consciousness into the body of another mutant whose regenerative powers would grant him eternal life. But outside the pyramid, betrayal is already unfolding. A group of Egyptians secretly turns against him and activates massive stone pillars designed to collapse the entire structure. As the giant blocks begin sliding inward, chaos erupts. The horsemen desperately battle the traitors while the pyramid crumbles around them. Huge slabs of stone crash through the chambers, killing everyone caught inside. In the middle of the destruction, Death sacrifices herself to shield En-Saba-Nur's body from the falling debris. She's crushed moments later, buried beneath the collapsing ruin along with the others. Though the transfer ritual succeeds, En-Saba-Nur remains trapped alive under the wreckage for thousands of years. The story then jumps forward to 1983 in Ohio. Inside a high school classroom, students discuss recent mutant-related events, specifically how Eric Lenscher, known to the world as Magneto, attacked a major peace summit and even threatened the president before being stopped by Raven Darkholme, publicly recognized as Mystique. Among the students is Scott Summers, who's clearly struggling with a strange problem involving his eyes. One of the boys in class notices Scott awkwardly squinting and assumes he's flirting with his girlfriend. Embarrassed and frustrated, Scott asks to leave for the restroom. The angry student follows him, looking for a fight. Scott quickly hides inside a bathroom stall to avoid confrontation, but panic causes him to lose control of the strange force building behind his eyes. Suddenly, an enormous energy blast erupts outward, smashing the bully into the walls and tearing through parts of the school in a violent explosion of power. At the same time, far away in West Berlin, crowds gather beneath an underground arena where mutants are forced to fight for entertainment. One of the main attractions is Angel, a mutant with enormous wings extending from his back. After defeating his opponent, he's introduced to a new challenger who's wheeled into the arena inside a cage. The newcomer is Kurt Wagner, better known as Nightcrawler, a frightened young mutant capable of teleporting wherever he can see. At first, Nightcrawler avoids fighting altogether, desperately trying to stay away from Angel. But Angel warns him that refusing to fight means death for both of them. Forced into action, Nightcrawler finally retaliates. Using his teleportation abilities, he catches Angel by surprise and hurls him into the arena's electrified barriers, badly scorching his wings. Before things turn deadly, Raven arrives at the arena and shuts down the electrical currents surrounding the ring. In the confusion, Angel escapes by flying away, while Raven helps Nightcrawler flee the underground prison. Together, they disappear before anyone can stop them. Elsewhere in Poland, Eric Lenscher has abandoned his old identity and is living quietly under the name Henryk Gorski. To ordinary people around him, he appears to be nothing more than a factory worker at a metal foundry. Hidden from the world, he's built a peaceful life with his wife Magda and their young daughter Nina. One evening, Eric softly sings Nina a lullaby passed down to him by his own parents. As they talk, he opens up about losing his family when he was a child and promises his daughter that no one will ever take her away from him the way his parents were taken from him. Meanwhile, Scott Summers is brought to Xavier's school for gifted youngsters by his older brother Alex Summers. To prevent accidents, Scott wears a blindfold over his eyes during the trip. Upon arriving at the school, Scott accidentally bumps into Jean Grey, a young telepathic mutant. The two briefly introduce themselves before Alex leads Scott deeper inside the mansion. They eventually meet Hank McCoy, also known as Beast, who now works as a teacher at the school. Together, they visit Professor Charles Xavier. Charles warmly welcomes both brothers and calmly asks Scott to remove his blindfold. Nervous and terrified of hurting someone, Scott hesitates, but Xavier reassures him that he's safe there. Following Charles' instructions, Scott unleashes the force hidden behind his eyes toward a target in the distance. The blast fires out with incredible power, slicing completely through a massive tree nearby. Xavier casually remarks that the tree had been planted by his grandfather years ago. Horrified by the destruction, Scott assumes he's about to be thrown out immediately. Instead, Charles is impressed by the raw strength of his abilities and officially accepts him into the school. Back in Cairo, CIA agent Maura MacTaggart secretly tracks a mysterious cult whose members all carry the same strange symbol on their necks. Following them underground, she discovers an ancient hidden chamber where a ritual is underway to awaken En-Saba-Nur from his centuries-long imprisonment. Before the ceremony fully completes, Mora manages to escape the chamber just in time. Moments later, En-Sabah-Nur awakens beneath the ruins, triggering a massive explosion powerful enough to send shockwaves across the planet. Earthquakes erupt worldwide. One of those tremors reaches the metal foundry in Poland where Eric works. During the chaos, a huge container filled with molten metal breaks loose and begins falling toward one of his coworkers. Unable to stand by and watch someone die, Eric secretly uses his magnetic powers to stop the accident and save the man's life. But afterward, he's left questioning whether exposing his abilities was a terrible mistake. At Xavier's school, Jean Grey experiences horrifying visions connected to the global disturbances. She sees destruction spreading across the Earth and glimpses what appears to be the end of the world itself. Disturbed by what she's sensing, she immediately goes to Charles Xavier and warns him that something catastrophic is coming. Jean is deeply disturbed by the terrifying visions flooding her mind. She admits to Charles that her own abilities frighten her because the destruction she sees feels far too real. Charles gently reassures her, reminding her that fear is natural when someone possesses power they don't fully understand. Wanting answers, he works together with Hank to use Cerebro and trace the source of the strange worldwide tremors. During the search, Charles unexpectedly discovers Moira MacTaggert connected to the incident, the same woman he once shared a close romantic history with. Meanwhile, Eric and Magda quietly prepare to disappear from their town for good. Knowing his secret identity could eventually be exposed, they decide to leave everything behind and start over somewhere no one has ever heard the name Magneto. Before they can escape, however, Magda realizes Nina is nowhere to be found. Panic sets in immediately, and the couple rushes into the nearby forest searching for their daughter. Not far away, local police officers have already found Nina. When Eric arrives, the authorities confront him after growing suspicious of who he really is. Realizing there's no way out without putting his family in greater danger, Eric finally admits the truth. He reveals that he is Magneto and offers to surrender peacefully if they promise to let Nina go unharmed. But the situation spirals out of control in seconds. Terrified for her father, Nina screams at the officers to leave him alone. Her emotional outburst unleashes her mutant abilities, causing nearby birds to violently swarm the policemen. In the confusion, one officer accidentally releases an arrow from his bow. The shot tragically strikes both Nina and Magda. Everything stops for Eric in that moment. He collapses beside his wife and daughter, devastated beyond words as they die in front of him. Grief quickly transforms into uncontrollable rage. Removing Nina's necklace from her body, Eric channels his pain into his powers and brutally turns the metal around him against the officers, slaughtering every single one of them in fury. Elsewhere in Egypt, En-Sabah-Nur, now fully awakened, walks freely through the modern world for the first time in thousands of years. As he wanders through Cairo, he notices a young mutant named Aurora Monroe, using her weather abilities to steal supplies and money before escaping from angry merchants. When several men corner her in an alley, Apocalypse intervenes effortlessly. Without hesitation, he kills multiple attackers in horrifying fashion and traps another man alive within a stone wall as a warning. At the same time, Charles and Alex Summers arrive to meet Moira MacTaggert. They question her about the mysterious events in Egypt, but Moira hesitates because the information is highly classified. When she asks how they even gained access to the secure facility, Charles casually claims he has an advanced clearance level that allows him to obtain whatever information he wants. The excuse clearly isn't true, but it works well enough to keep the conversation going. Back in Cairo, Aurora takes Apocalypse to the hidden place where she lives and offers him food. Fascinated by the modern world, Apocalypse begins studying television broadcasts to rapidly absorb human language, history, culture, and technology. The more he learns, the more disgusted he becomes. To him, humanity has become weak, corrupt, and obsessed with false idols. He concludes that civilization must be destroyed and rebuilt from the ground up. Aurora explains that mutants like them are forced to live under human laws, constantly hiding who they are. Apocalypse manipulates her with promises of strength and purpose, convincing her to stand beside him. With a touch, he dramatically amplifies her mutant powers, making her abilities far more dangerous than before. Elsewhere, Raven takes Nightcrawler to meet Caliban, a mutant who secretly helps others by creating fake identities and passports so they can avoid persecution. During their meeting, Caliban informs Raven about the terrible tragedy involving Eric Lenscher. The moment she hears the news, Raven immediately decides to go after him, bringing Nightcrawler along. Back at Xavier's school, Hank finishes designing a special pair of ruby-colored glasses for Scott. The lenses help contain the destructive energy from his eyes, finally allowing Scott to look around normally without fear of accidentally hurting someone. As he settles in, he finds himself constantly staring at Jean. There's an instant connection between them, even if neither fully understands it yet. Later, when several students tease them, Scott becomes self-conscious and assumes everyone sees him as some kind of monster. Jean quietly reassures him, admitting that many people at the school struggle with controlling their powers. She tells him he's far from the only freak there, making Scott feel slightly less alone. Meanwhile, Apocalypse and Storm track down Caliban in search of powerful mutants worthy of joining their cause. Caliban refuses to cooperate, unwilling to help them recruit anyone. Before tensions escalate further, Psylocke arrives to investigate the disturbance herself. Apocalypse immediately senses her potential and unlocks hidden depths within her abilities. Impressed by the power he offers, Psylocke willingly joins him. Not long afterward, they encounter Angel, whose wings remain badly scarred from the underground fight arena. Psylocke suggests moving on to search for stronger allies elsewhere, but Apocalypse has other plans. He transforms Angel's damaged wings into terrifying metallic weapons far deadlier than before. Grateful and empowered, Angel pledges himself to Apocalypse as another follower. At Xavier's mansion, Raven and Nightcrawler finally arrive at the school. Hank is shocked but genuinely happy to see Raven again, warmly welcoming both of them inside. Nightcrawler quickly meets the younger students, including Scott, and the group decides to take him to a shopping mall since he's never experienced anything like it before. While they talk privately, Hank urges Raven to convince Charles that the world desperately needs a true X-Men team. He believes mutants must step forward to protect both humans and their own kind. Raven, however, explains that she didn't come there for that reason. She came because Eric needs help. Consumed by grief and vengeance, Eric returns to the metal foundry where he worked. Using his magnetic powers, he seals every exit and locks down the entire factory, trapping everyone inside with him. He coldly asks the workers if they know what it feels like to lose the people they love most. Then he warns them that their own families are about to experience that same unbearable pain forever. Just as Eric prepares to massacre everyone inside, Apocalypse suddenly teleports into the factory alongside his followers. Eric angrily tells him not to interfere and makes it clear he has no interest in anyone being saved. But Apocalypse responds in terrifying fashion by instantly burying everyone in the building beneath the earth and debris. Afterward, Apocalypse takes Eric to Auschwitz, the very place where his powers first emerged as a child and where his lifelong suffering truly began. Standing among the memories of trauma and loss, Apocalypse encourages Eric to stop holding back his hatred. He tells him to draw strength from his pain and manipulate the metal hidden deep within the earth itself. Fueled by rage, Eric unleashes his full power. Massive structures begin collapsing around him as metal tears through the environment under his control. Watching the destruction unfold, Apocalypse promises that together they will create an entirely new world from the ashes of the old one. News of the horrific tragedy in Poland quickly spreads across television networks around the world. Sitting alone at home, Peter Maximoff, better known as Quicksilver, quietly watches the report about Eric Lenscher. The moment his mother walks into the room, Peter hurriedly changes the channel and pretends he's distracted by a video game instead. But she immediately realizes what he was really watching. She warns him not to chase after Eric, clearly worried about what could happen if Peter gets involved with the man he secretly knows is his father. Back at Xavier's school, Charles, Alex Summers, and Maura return from their investigation in Egypt. Charles is genuinely surprised to discover Raven waiting there. When Raven greets Maura warmly, Maura stares back in confusion, having no memory of her at all. Raven quickly realizes something is wrong, and Charles reluctantly explains that years earlier, he erased Maura's memories before she left his life. Raven wastes no time telling Charles about the disaster involving Eric and the death of his family. Realizing how unstable Eric must be emotionally, Charles immediately turns to Cerebro in hopes of locating him before things spiral further out of control. Using the machine, Charles finally reaches Eric mentally. He pleads with him to come back so they can help him recover from the tragedy, but Eric bitterly rejects the offer. He tells Charles that he spent years trying to live peacefully the way Charles always believed he should, yet humanity never stopped hunting him. In the end, the world took away everything he loved anyway. Broken and furious, Eric declares that now the world deserves to suffer the same pain he feels. As Charles continues speaking with him, he suddenly senses another powerful mind nearby. Before he fully understands what's happening, Apocalypse notices Charles through the psychic connection. Fascinated by Xavier's abilities, Apocalypse immediately forces his way into Charles' mind and seizes control of the connection itself. With access to Charles' immense psychic reach, Apocalypse extends his consciousness across the globe. He effortlessly taps into military systems around the world and launches every nuclear weapon on Earth into space, eliminating humanity's ability to fight back. Realizing how dangerous the situation has become, Charles desperately orders Alex to destroy Cerebro before Apocalypse gains even more power through it. As everyone rushes to evacuate the room, Apocalypse suddenly teleports directly into the mansion alongside his followers and abducts Charles. Alex desperately tries to stop them, unleashing a powerful blast in the process. But the attack accidentally hits Hank's laboratory equipment instead, triggering a massive chain reaction that tears through the mansion in a catastrophic explosion. At that exact moment, Quicksilver arrives. In one of the film's most chaotic sequences, Peter races through the exploding mansion at incredible speed, rescuing students and teachers one by one while debris, fire, and collapsing walls freeze around him in slow motion. He manages to evacuate nearly everyone before the building completely erupts into destruction. Not long afterward, Scott, Jean, Nightcrawler, and another student return from their outing at the mall only to find Xavier's school reduced to ruins. Shocked and horrified, Scott immediately searches for Alex. Hank sadly explains that Alex was closest to the blast when the explosion happened, and there was no way to save him. Devastated, Scott walks away in silence to grieve alone, while Jean and Nightcrawler try their best to comfort him. Suddenly, a military helicopter lands near the wreckage. The arriving soldiers claim they're there to provide emergency medical assistance. Mora initially assumes they belong to another government agency, but her suspicion grows when their commander steps forward and removes his mask. The man is revealed to be William Stryker. Without warning, Stryker's troops unleash a sonic weapon that incapacitates nearly everyone at the scene. Only Scott, Jean, and Nightcrawler manage to avoid capture. Thinking quickly, Jean uses her telepathic abilities to manipulate the mind of one of the soldiers, helping the three remain hidden while Stryker's forces seize Raven, Hank, Peter, and Mora. Determined to rescue the others, Scott convinces Nightcrawler to teleport them secretly aboard the helicopter. Jean protects their minds during the infiltration, allowing them to sneak inside unnoticed. But once they enter the aircraft, they discover an energy field designed specifically to suppress mutant abilities, leaving them trapped without powers. Stryker transports the captured mutants to his heavily guarded facility. Raven, Hank, Moira, and Peter are locked together inside a secure holding cell. They attempt to warn Stryker about Apocalypse and the global threat he represents, but Stryker dismisses everything they say and walks away, refusing to listen. Meanwhile, Apocalypse takes Charles and the Horsemen back to the ancient site that once belonged to him. There, he orders Charles to broadcast a message to every mind on Earth. Charles refuses, insisting he cannot reach the entire world without Cerebro. Apocalypse coldly replies that with Xavier's powers under his control, no machine is necessary. Back inside the prison cell, Peter quietly opens up to Raven. He asks whether Eric is truly as evil as people claim. Then he reveals something deeply personal. Magneto is actually his father. Moments later, Charles' psychic voice suddenly echoes across the planet, transmitted through Apocalypse's amplified connection. Every person on Earth hears the message inside their minds. Hidden within it, however, Charles secretly sends a private signal intended only for Jean, hoping she will understand what he's trying to tell her. Elsewhere in the facility, Scott, Jean, and Nightcrawler manage to sneak into the generator section while searching for their friends. As they move through the area, they hear violent growling coming from a secured chamber nearby. Scott nervously jokes that it sounds like some kind of wild animal, but Jean senses something different. Calmly, she tells him it isn't an animal at all, it's a man. As armed guards begin approaching the area, Jean unlocks the chamber. Inside is Wolverine. The moment he's released, chaos erupts instantly. Wolverine tears through every soldier in his path with savage brutality, cutting down anyone who gets close as he storms through the corridors searching for escape. Scott, Jean, and Nightcrawler cautiously follow behind him through the aftermath. Eventually, Jean manages to stop Wolverine long enough to reach into his damaged mind. She gently removes part of the mental conditioning controlling him and restores fragments of his lost memories. Though still confused and feral, Wolverine quietly leaves the facility without saying a single word. Soon after, the trio finally reaches the prison cells. Scott uses his optic blast to destroy the cell door, freeing Raven, Hank, Peter, and Moira. With everyone reunited, the group quickly prepares to track down Apocalypse and rescue Charles before the world falls completely into chaos. Apocalypse begins reshaping the world in his image. Using Magneto's immense powers, he reconstructs his ancient pyramid from the ruins of modern civilization while entire cities collapse around them. Buildings crumble, the earth itself tears apart, and chaos spreads globally as Eric manipulates metal on a catastrophic scale under Apocalypse's command. During the destruction, Charles finally understands why Apocalypse captured him alive instead of simply killing him. When he questions his purpose, Apocalypse reveals that Charles plays the most important role in his plans. He intends to transfer his consciousness into Xavier's body, giving himself direct psychic access to every mind on the planet. Meanwhile, Raven and the others finally arrive near the pyramid to launch their rescue mission. They quickly split responsibilities. Raven and Peter decide to focus entirely on reaching Eric and trying to bring him back to his senses, while the others attempt to infiltrate the pyramid and save Charles before the transfer ritual is completed. Inside the structure, Apocalypse orders his horsemen to prepare for battle. He commands them to stop anyone from interfering until the consciousness transfer is finished. The fight begins almost immediately. Hank teams up with Scott, Jean, and Nightcrawler to create an opening. Together, they manage to catch Angel off guard long enough for Nightcrawler to teleport deeper into the pyramid. But Angel quickly recovers and aggressively pursues him through the collapsing structure. Outside, Scott, Jean, and Hank are intercepted by Storm and Psylocke before they can advance any farther. A brutal battle erupts between them as debris and destruction surround the pyramid. Nightcrawler eventually confronts Angel again in another intense fight. Despite Angel's enhanced metallic wings and savage attacks, Nightcrawler manages to evade him long enough to teleport farther inside the pyramid in search of Charles. Meanwhile, the others continue struggling against Apocalypse's horsemen, barely holding their ground. At the same time, Raven confronts Eric directly. She pleads with him not to surrender completely to his anger, reminding him that he still has people who care about him. She insists his life is not over yet, and that he still has a family among them. Peter nervously tries several times to reveal the truth that Eric is his father, but fear keeps stopping him before he can finally say the words. Deep inside the pyramid, Nightcrawler reaches Charles just moments before Apocalypse completes the consciousness transfer. Acting quickly, he teleports Charles out of danger and begins rescuing the others one by one, bringing them back to their jet before the structure completely collapses around them. The group attempts to escape, but Apocalypse's horsemen aren't about to let them leave so easily. Angel and Psylocke attack the aircraft midair, tearing it apart and forcing everyone into a desperate evacuation. Nightcrawler repeatedly teleports the team away from the crashing wreckage, barely managing to keep everyone alive. Not long afterward, Apocalypse fully regains consciousness and immediately begins searching mentally for Charles. At first, Quicksilver uses his incredible speed to overwhelm Apocalypse with a barrage of attacks, landing several rapid hits before Apocalypse reacts. But the ancient mutant quickly adapts and traps Peter by forcing the ground itself to restrain him. Raven rushes in to save Peter but fails to free him. Apocalypse then taunts Charles, demanding that he help his friends if he truly cares about them. Realizing he still shares a psychic connection with Apocalypse, Charles attempts to enter his mind and fight him mentally from within. But Apocalypse is far stronger and more experienced than expected. Instead of stopping him, Charles accidentally allows Apocalypse to trace his exact location. Apocalypse immediately marches toward Charles with unstoppable force. Just when it seems no one can stop him, Eric suddenly turns against Apocalypse. Finally rejecting the destruction and manipulation consuming him, Magneto blocks Apocalypse from reaching Charles. The others quickly join Eric, combining their powers against the ancient mutant. Even together, however, they struggle to overpower him. Seeing how hopeless the battle has become, Charles turns to Jean and tells her to stop holding back. He urges her to release the full power she has always feared inside herself. Jean finally unleashes her true abilities. An overwhelming cosmic force erupts from her, consuming Apocalypse with terrifying intensity. For the first time, Apocalypse is genuinely overpowered. As Jean's power weakens him and the others continue attacking, Apocalypse desperately attempts to escape. But Storm, finally realizing the monster she has been serving, blocks his path and refuses to let him flee. Completely overwhelmed, Apocalypse begins disintegrating. As his body crumbles away, he quietly whispers that everything has been revealed before finally vanishing forever. After the battle ends, Jean helps restore Charles' damaged consciousness. Once he recovers, Charles uses his powers to return Moira's lost memories, allowing her to remember their shared past together at last. Eventually, everyone returns home to begin rebuilding what was destroyed. Eric quietly assists with reconstructing the school alongside Jean, helping repair the damage caused during the attack. During this time, Aurora asks Peter whether he plans to finally tell Eric the truth about being his son. Peter admits that maybe someday he will, but for now, he's content simply staying close to the people around him. Charles later asks Eric to remain at the school and help guide the younger mutants moving forward, but Eric decides it's time for him to leave. Before departing, he shares a respectful farewell with Charles and wishes him luck with whatever comes next. In the final moments, Raven officially begins training the next generation of X-Men. Hank activates the Danger Room systems, releasing combat robots for practice as the young mutants prepare themselves for the battles still waiting ahead. When people revisit the modern X-Men films, the conversation almost always gravitates toward the same handful of titles. X-Men, Days of Future Past still gets brought up constantly. A lot of audiences continue to hold genuine affection for X-Men, First Class. Even the Wolverine has gained a stronger reputation over time than it initially had on release. And then there's X-Men. Apocalypse, the unusually divisive middle chapter that never seems to inspire a fully unified reaction from anyone. Because honestly, responses to this film remain remarkably scattered. Some viewers genuinely dislike it to the point where they see it as the moment the franchise began losing its identity. Others defend it as an ambitious, chaotic superhero spectacle that absorbed far more criticism than it truly deserved. And every time I revisit it, I end up caught somewhere between those two perspectives. The first hour usually pulls me back in. I start thinking maybe the film has been underestimated over the years. Then the second half unfolds, and gradually, the reasons behind its complicated reputation start becoming clear again. What makes the movie especially interesting is the position it occupied historically. This arrived immediately after X-Men, Days of Future Past, which was arguably the closest the franchise ever came to feeling emotionally grounded and genuinely massive at the same time. That film carried momentum. It carried urgency. It felt like the series had finally discovered how to balance the older cast, the younger cast, the political allegory, the time travel mechanics, and the emotional weight all within the same narrative. So Apocalypse inherited an almost impossible assignment: follow one of the most beloved X-Men films ever made, while simultaneously attempting to expand the scale even further. And you can feel the pressure of that expectation almost immediately. Bigger stakes, bigger destruction, bigger spectacle, bigger antagonist. Everything suddenly has to operate on a global scale, entire cities collapsing, civilizations falling apart, humanity pushed toward the brink once again. It's that familiar blockbuster escalation where every sequel feels obligated to amplify the volume of the previous one. And maybe that's part of why the film occasionally feels strangely exhausting. The earlier prequel films had identities beyond their action sequences. X-Men, First Class had the Cold War atmosphere. X-Men, Days of Future Past carried paranoia, dystopian tension, and political anxiety. Even when those movies became uneven, they still felt connected to a larger thematic foundation. Apocalypse, despite being set in the 1980s, mostly uses the decade as visual decoration. A few carefully selected songs, some period fashion, a quick joke about Return of the Jedi, and that's largely where the time period begins and ends. The setting rarely becomes part of the film's emotional identity. And then there's the broader sense of franchise fatigue that had started emerging around this era, not just within X-Men specifically, but across superhero cinema as a whole. Audiences had already experienced countless world-ending skybeams, collapsing skylines, ancient godlike antagonists, and increasingly digital climaxes by that point. So when Apocalypse arrives with another, the world will be remade narrative, there's an unavoidable sense of familiarity surrounding it, not outright boredom, more a feeling of recognition. As though the film is assembling elements audiences had already seen executed more effectively elsewhere. What makes the reaction to the movie so fascinating, though, is that even many of its critics still acknowledge aspects they genuinely enjoy. Certain performances, certain sequences, Quicksilver, obviously, Magneto's arc, some of the imagery, there are fragments of a truly compelling X-Men film buried throughout Apocalypse. You can absolutely see them, which honestly makes the weaker material stand out even more sharply. And strangely, I don't think the film is remembered with the same level of hostility as something like X-Men, The Last Stand, or X-Men Origins, Wolverine. Those became cultural punchlines for years. Apocalypse never quite reached that level. Instead, it settled into something more ambiguous. People debate it, defend sections of it, forget parts of it entirely. Revisit it years later and realize it wasn't nearly as disastrous as they remembered, or sometimes discover the opposite reaction. It exists in this unusual gray area where the movie is rarely completely ineffective, but also rarely feels entirely alive. And honestly, that's probably the most accurate way to describe X-Men, Apocalypse overall, a film reaching for mythic scale while gradually drifting away from the qualities that made these X-Men stories resonate in the first place. Because the actual premise sounds enormous on paper, almost absurdly ambitious. The film opens thousands of years in the past, in ancient Egypt, where En-Sabah-Nur, later known as Apocalypse, is treated almost like a living deity. And to the movie's credit, it commits to that mythology immediately. Massive pyramids, ceremonial rituals, followers chanting in devotion, power transfers between mutant bodies. The atmosphere is grand, ancient, and completely serious from the opening moments. And honestly, that introduction works surprisingly well. There's something genuinely compelling about the idea that the world's first mutant has existed beneath history this entire time, buried while civilization slowly evolved around him. It taps into that old-school comic book mythology that X-Men occasionally handles beautifully when it fully embraces the scale of its ideas. The opening feels mythological, rather than simply large action film, large. But eventually, the movie has to build an actual narrative around Apocalypse himself, and that's where things become less stable, because his philosophy ultimately boils down to something very familiar. Humanity has grown weak, civilization is corrupt, the world must be destroyed and rebuilt, and he alone will reshape it through chosen followers. And if you've watched enough blockbuster cinema, that rhetoric starts sounding recognizable almost immediately. Ancient godlike figure awakens after centuries and decides modern society has failed. It's a framework audiences had already encountered many times before. The film constantly tries to position Apocalypse as the ultimate threat. Not simply another antagonist, but the antagonist, the first mutant, the most powerful mutant, a figure who has supposedly been worshipped across history under countless names and identities. The script wants him to feel almost beyond human comprehension. Ironically, the more the film insists on how powerful Apocalypse is, the less dramatically compelling he becomes. Part of that comes from how undefined his abilities feel. He can transfer consciousness, manipulate matter, expand physically, dismantle entire cities, enhance other mutants, survive seemingly anything imaginable. Eventually, he starts feeling less like a character and more like a constantly evolving visual effects mechanism. Entire environments collapse and reshape around him, yet because the boundaries of his power are never clearly established, the tension starts becoming abstract too. The audience eventually begins wondering what limitations actually exist at all. And I think that ambiguity weakens the scale more than it strengthens it. Because once every threat becomes world-ending by default, the movie has to keep escalating visually simply to maintain momentum. Cities collapse, buildings sink into the earth, famous landmarks are torn apart, destruction unfolds everywhere simultaneously, and eventually the mind stops processing it emotionally. It becomes visual overload rather than dramatic impact, which is interesting because the premise itself actually contained the foundation for something more focused and character-driven. The idea of Apocalypse recruiting vulnerable mutants who feel abandoned, angry, or disconnected from humanity is a genuinely strong X-Men concept. It aligns perfectly with the franchise's core themes. There's another version of this story hidden underneath all the large-scale disaster imagery. You can see glimpses of it through Magneto especially, where Apocalypse manipulates grief and emotional devastation rather than simply appearing as another generic conqueror. But the film keeps returning to large-scale extinction imagery instead. And honestly, I've always felt the movie might have benefited from introducing Apocalypse gradually across multiple films. Let the mythology develop over time. Let his presence linger in the background first. Let the Horsemen relationships evolve naturally. Because here, everything happens with such speed that Apocalypse ultimately feels less like an ancient, unstoppable force and more like the next escalation point the franchise needed to reach. Which becomes frustrating because visually, the film clearly wants Apocalypse to feel iconic, and there are moments where it almost succeeds. Certain shots of him standing calmly within collapsing cities, confronting Magneto, or emerging after centuries beneath the earth genuinely carry presence. In those scenes, you can feel the movie reaching for something biblical and intimidating. There's an operatic quality to the imagery that occasionally works exactly the way it's intended to. But then he starts speaking more, or the narrative pauses to explain another layer of his master plan, and suddenly, the illusion slips back into more familiar blockbuster territory again. And honestly, I think that's the central issue with the premise overall. It's not that the movie aimed too high. X-Men stories should occasionally feel ambitious on a massive scale. The problem is that Apocalypse often confuses size with emotional weight, bigger destruction. bigger powers, bigger stakes, but not necessarily deeper stakes. So even though the film constantly insists the world is ending, it rarely feels as urgent as it should. One thing that stood out to me revisiting X-Men, Apocalypse, is how strangely disconnected the movie feels from its own time period. This is supposed to be the 1980s, and technically, yes, the film keeps reminding you of that. There's the music, the jackets, the hairstyles, the shopping mall scenes, the quick reference to Return of the Jedi that almost everyone remembers. A Eurythmics track plays and immediately signals, yes, this is the decade we're in. But compared to X-Men, First Class or X-Men, Days of Future Past, the 1980s here feel mostly cosmetic. And that's strange because those earlier films genuinely integrated their historical settings into the storytelling itself. First Class used the Cuban Missile Crisis as a structural part of the plot. Days of Future Past leaned heavily into the paranoia and political atmosphere surrounding the 1970s. Even without the mutant abilities, those films still possessed a distinct sense of place and identity. Apocalypse feels more like characters wearing 1980s aesthetics inside a fairly conventional superhero narrative. There's rarely a moment where the era meaningfully shapes the story. Most of it functions as reference material, little reminders. Remember this song, remember arcades, remember Thriller, and some of it is entertaining, to be fair. The film isn't visually lifeless. There's real energy in certain sequences, especially early on when the younger mutants are first introduced. But the decade never becomes part of the movie's emotional DNA the way the 1960s and 1970s did in the earlier installments. Honestly, there were moments where I almost forgot the movie was set in the 1980s entirely until another nostalgic reference suddenly appeared to remind me. And then there's the timeline issue. This franchise has always operated with fairly flexible continuity. At a certain point, most viewers simply accept that the X-Men timeline follows comic book logic and move forward. But Apocalypse really pushes that flexibility to its limit, because now another decade has passed since X-Men, Days of Future Past, which itself already took place years after X-Men. First Class, and somehow almost nobody appears to have aged at all. Magneto still looks virtually identical. Charles looks the same. Beast looks the same. Mystique at least has shape-shifting abilities built into the character, so the movie gets some leniency there. But Moira Havok, nearly everyone exists inside this strange, timeless suspension where decades keep passing, but nobody's appearance reflects it in any meaningful way. And honestly, this kind of thing doesn't automatically ruin a film for me. Superhero stories naturally require a certain amount of suspension of disbelief. The issue is that the franchise itself keeps emphasizing the passage of time. Every installment deliberately advances another decade, so eventually the disconnect becomes impossible not to notice. By the time Apocalypse arrives, it almost starts becoming unintentionally amusing. Because the movie wants the emotional weight of history, experience, and aging, but visually the characters still feel anchored in the same moment. It creates this strange separation, where they never truly feel like people who have lived through the years the story claims they have. And I think that contributes to the film occasionally feeling oddly weightless. Even the continuity between timelines starts becoming difficult to untangle if you think about it for too long. Certain characters remain alive when the logic suggests they perhaps shouldn't be. Some relationships no longer line up properly. Ages stop making sense altogether. Eventually, most viewers simply surrender to it. And to be fair, many audiences genuinely do not care about continuity issues like these. They're here for mutant abilities, large-scale action, and memorable spectacle. That's completely understandable. But for viewers deeply invested in the franchise, it started feeling like the series was becoming less careful, less grounded, less interested in preserving the internal logic that originally helped these films feel believable despite their fantasy elements. And the ironic part is the movie almost acknowledges its own problem at one point. There's that scene outside the theater where the characters joke about how the third installment in a trilogy is usually the weakest one. Audiences laughed at the time because it was clearly referencing X-Men, The Last Stand, but revisiting it now, the line almost feels unintentionally self-aware. Because Apocalypse is where the prequel era begins feeling less like a carefully evolving story and more like a franchise trying to keep itself moving before it fully understood where it wanted to go next. What's fascinating about X-Men Apocalypse is that for a while, it genuinely feels like it could become something great. The first act is probably the strongest section of the film by a considerable margin, and every time I revisit it, I find myself getting pulled in again. The opening has scale. There's genuine mystery surrounding Apocalypse. The younger mutants are being introduced effectively. Magneto's storyline carries emotional weight. The movie actually begins with momentum, real momentum, and I think part of that works because, early on, the film hasn't started juggling every storyline simultaneously yet. It's still allowing itself time to establish characters properly. Scott Summers discovering his abilities feels appropriately chaotic and uncomfortable. The sequences inside Xavier's school have a relaxed energy that the later portions of the movie almost completely lose. Jean Grey and Nightcrawler are introduced naturally. Even the quieter scenes, characters talking, wandering through the mansion, slowly trying to understand themselves, are given room to breathe. That sense of space matters. And it's something the second half gradually abandons. But early on, there's this feeling that the film might genuinely focus on the younger generation stepping into the spotlight, and for a while, that angle actually works. Beneath the larger apocalypse storyline, there's a subtle coming-of-age atmosphere running through the movie that's surprisingly effective. You can see the structure of a more character-focused X-Men story hidden underneath everything else. And honestly, some of the introductions are genuinely strong. Nightcrawler especially leaves an immediate impression. He brings personality into scenes effortlessly, without feeling exaggerated or forced. There's awkwardness to him, nervous energy, quiet humor. He feels human almost immediately, which becomes especially important in a film overloaded with spectacle and large-scale destruction. Jean and Scott also work reasonably well in the beginning, because the film initially keeps their storyline grounded. At first, it's less about saving the world and more about identity, fear, isolation, the classic themes that have always made X-Men compelling in the first place. Even Apocalypse himself is arguably more interesting before the movie fully explains him. When he first awakens and begins wandering through the modern world, there's actual intrigue in the concept. The idea of this ancient being examining modern civilization with confusion, disappointment, and fascination could have led somewhere genuinely compelling. The film contains small moments where you can almost glimpse a more restrained and intelligent version of the story underneath everything. And visually, the first act is honestly pretty strong as well. The ancient Egypt sequence carries real atmosphere. The early sequences in Cairo carry texture and atmosphere. Even the quieter scenes inside Xavier's mansion have warmth and personality before the film eventually transitions into near-constant large-scale destruction. Whatever criticisms people may have about Bryan Singer as a filmmaker, he always understood how to stage mutant introductions and smaller character interactions in a way that felt grounded enough to draw you in, at least temporarily. Because eventually you can feel the film beginning to overload itself. More subplots arrive, more characters enter the story, more exposition starts moving at rapid speed, more world-ending stakes, more Horsemen recruitment scenes, more constant cutting between parallel storylines, and gradually, almost without noticing it at first, the pacing becomes heavier and more crowded. But the first act avoids that collapse for a surprisingly long stretch of time. There's also this subtle sense of optimism early in the film that I genuinely like. Xavier's school feels alive, mutants are learning, relationships are beginning to form, for brief periods X-Men. Apocalypse almost feels like it's building toward a true, next generation of X-Men story. You start imagining where these younger versions of Cyclops, Jean, Storm, and Nightcrawler might evolve in future films. And honestly, I think that's part of why the first hour becomes frustrating in retrospect, because it establishes potential the movie never fully delivers on. You can almost pinpoint the exact moment where the film shifts from interesting character setup into overloaded superhero spectacle. The transition is gradual, but you absolutely feel it happening. Scenes become shorter, emotional moments become rushed, characters stop evolving naturally and instead begin moving around the narrative like pieces being repositioned across a board. Still, I can't deny that the opening consistently pulls me in every single time. And honestly, that's part of what makes Apocalypse such a difficult film to discuss. If it had been ineffective from the very beginning, audiences probably would have forgotten it entirely. Instead, it gives you just enough in its opening stretch to convince you it might actually be building towards something much stronger. If there's one storyline in X-Men, Apocalypse, that almost everyone seems to agree works, it's Magneto's, and honestly, I don't even think it's close. Every time the movie cuts back to Eric, the film suddenly feels more grounded, more emotional, more focused. For a few minutes, it remembers what made the strongest X-Men stories resonate in the first place. Not massive sky beams or ancient beings delivering speeches about destiny. Just damaged people trying, and usually failing, to escape pain they can never fully outrun. When we first find Magneto in this story, he's hiding in Poland, attempting to live an ordinary life, a new identity, factory work. A wife, a daughter. He's pursuing something that almost feels impossible for this character, peace, and Michael Fassbender communicates that exhaustion immediately. there's a quiet sadness running underneath his performance in those early scenes. He's calmer, softer even, but none of it feels secure. It's as though he already understands that the world could remind him who he truly is at any moment. Fassbender plays Eric like a man permanently bracing himself for tragedy before it arrives. Which inevitably it does. And honestly, the family tragedy sequence still lands with real emotional force, partly because the movie finally slows down long enough to let the moment breathe. It isn't buried underneath constant humor or nonstop spectacle. The sequence feels sudden, cruel, and deeply uncomfortable in a way blockbuster films sometimes avoid. You feel Eric's panic first, then the anger. Then that devastating realization that everything he tried to build has been taken away again. It's an intensely painful scene, and what makes it effective isn't only the tragedy itself. It's the fact that the franchise has already spent multiple films showing Magneto attempting to suppress this part of himself, trying to believe Xavier may ultimately be right, trying to exist without surrendering entirely to rage. So when he breaks here, it doesn't feel random, it feels inevitable, and that's what makes it unsettling, because Apocalypse doesn't really recruit Magneto through ideology, he recruits him through grief, through emotional collapse. He finds Eric at the precise moment where his faith in humanity has shattered once again, and suddenly aligning himself with a world-destroying mutant god almost begins making emotional sense. Almost. Now, I do think the film pushes the scale too far at certain points. There's definitely a stage where Magneto moves from emotionally broken to accidentally helping destabilize the entire planet, and the escalation becomes so extreme that Xavier continuing to defend him starts becoming difficult to process logically. At some point you start thinking, Charles, I admire the optimism, but Eric has crossed several boundaries here. Still, emotionally, the movie keeps returning to Magneto because deep down it understands he's the strongest material it has. And Fassbender absolutely carries those scenes. Even when the screenplay becomes messy, he keeps finding small human details inside the performance. The silence after tragedy, the restrained anger, the bitterness whenever Xavier becomes part of the conversation. There's a sequence where Apocalypse amplifies Eric's abilities, and you can see pain, release, grief, and surrender all passing across Fassbender's face simultaneously. It's one of the few moments in the film where the spectacle genuinely connects to character emotion, because for Eric, power has always been inseparable from trauma. That's why his scenes stand out so sharply compared to much of the surrounding movie. While other characters become trapped inside digital chaos or rushed subplots, Magneto's storyline retains an emotional spine. You understand what he lost. You understand why he's angry. You understand why Xavier refuses to abandon him despite everything. And honestly, the Xavier-Eric relationship still remains the emotional core of these prequel films, even here, within one of the franchise's messier entries. There's something genuinely tragic about watching Charles continue believing there's still goodness inside his friend, while the world around them repeatedly reinforces Eric's darkest worldview. The film doesn't always handle that conflict perfectly, but whenever James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender share scenes together, the franchise suddenly regains some of its emotional gravity again, which also creates a strange problem for the movie itself. Magneto's material is so much stronger than most of the surrounding narrative that it almost exposes the weakness of everything else. You start realizing the emotional center of the film has surprisingly little to do with Apocalypse himself. The antagonist may be responsible for ending the world, but Magneto is the reason the movie feels emotionally alive at all. And honestly, without Fassbender, I think this film struggles far more than it already does. One of the biggest opportunities X-Men, Apocalypse had, at least conceptually, was the chance to properly introduce the next generation of X-Men. This was supposed to be the movie where younger versions of Cyclops, Jean Grey, Nightcrawler, Storm, and several other iconic characters finally stepped into the spotlight. And honestly, early on, I was completely on board with that direction. There's something genuinely enjoyable about watching the school gradually fill with mutants who still haven't figured themselves out yet. The film briefly reconnects with that classic X-Men atmosphere again. Confused teenagers, unstable powers, awkward introductions, people desperately trying to understand where they belong. When the movie focuses on that material, it actually feels surprisingly alive. Scott Summers especially receives a significantly stronger introduction here than he ever did in the original trilogy, which admittedly isn't an especially difficult achievement considering those earlier films treated Cyclops with remarkably little depth. But still, watching young Scott struggle with powers he literally cannot control works surprisingly well. The optic blasts feel dangerous again, painful even, there's embarrassment to him, fear, a sense that his own body has suddenly become unpredictable, and Ty Sheridan plays Scott with an awkward nervousness that fits this younger version of the character effectively. He hasn't become the composed leader yet. He's still just a teenager trying not to accidentally tear through walls every time he opens his eyes. Jean Grey's introduction works in a similar way. Sophie Turner doesn't receive an enormous amount of deeply layered material here, but she still manages to give Jean Grey a quiet instability beneath the surface. There's always something slightly restrained about her performance, like the character is constantly holding back something dangerous. The film keeps hinting at how powerful Jean truly is without fully unleashing it yet, and for a while that gradual buildup actually works surprisingly well. Nightcrawler, though, is probably the easiest new character to immediately connect with. Cody Smith-McPhee gives him an awkward charm that feels effortless and natural. He's funny without aggressively pushing into comic relief territory, which matters because this movie occasionally struggles with humor in a way that feels forced elsewhere. Nightcrawler's innocence gives the film a warmth it genuinely needs. Even the smaller moments, meeting the other students, exploring the mansion, reacting nervously to unfamiliar situations, help the movie feel less mechanical and overdesigned. And honestly, I kind of wish the film spent even more time simply letting these characters exist together. Because strangely enough, those quieter school interactions remain more memorable to me than a large portion of the apocalypse-scale spectacle. Storm is where things start becoming frustrating again, because Alexandra Shipp absolutely has screen presence. You can see glimpses of a genuinely compelling younger Storm underneath the material she's given. The problem is that the film never fully commits to developing her beyond, recruited by Apocalypse. The same issue applies to Angel, honestly. He's visually striking at times, occasionally gets a strong image or moment, and then the narrative mostly forgets to give him emotional significance afterward. Jubilee might honestly be the clearest example of the movie's overcrowding problem. She's introduced with this energy that practically says, "Look who's finally arrived," and then the film seems completely unsure what to actually do with her after that point. She ends up existing around the edges of scenes, almost like the franchise is fulfilling an obligation rather than building a meaningful character. And that becomes the recurring issue with nearly all of the younger mutants in this movie. You can feel the potential constantly sitting there beneath the surface, but the film keeps rushing past it before anything fully develops. That's what makes X-Men Apocalypse such a frustrating viewing experience at times. Because there are stretches where it genuinely feels like the beginning of an exciting new era for the X-Men franchise. New students, new personalities, younger versions of iconic characters trying to understand themselves. There's a legitimate coming-of-age film hidden somewhere inside this story. But the movie becomes so busy juggling massive stakes, Apocalypse mythology, Magneto's emotional arc, Mystique's leadership role, Wolverine cameos, destruction sequences, Horsemen subplots, and countless additional storylines that the younger cast never fully receives space to breathe. Which is unfortunate, because several of them genuinely could have carried future installments. And you can tell the movie wants that outcome. It constantly frames Jean, Scott, and Nightcrawler as the future of the franchise. Jean especially carries this ongoing sense that the story is building towards something far larger for her later on. But by the end, most of the younger characters still feel more like introductions than fully realized people. Not bad introductions either, that's the frustrating part, just incomplete ones. And honestly, that's kind of the defining theme of Apocalypse overall. So many strong individual pieces, so much visible potential. Just never enough focus to properly unify everything. Now we have to talk about Mystique, because X-Men Apocalypse makes a very deliberate creative decision with her character, and whether that choice works for you honestly changes how you experience a significant portion of the film. This movie essentially positions Mystique as the emotional center of the X-Men team. She's rescuing mutants, inspiring younger characters, mentoring Nightcrawler, leading missions, motivating students. At times, the film almost frames her as the central face of the entire franchise, and honestly, I never completely believed it. Not because Mystique can't be an important character, she absolutely can. But the version of Mystique these prequel films gradually evolved into always felt caught between several different creative directions. In X-Men First Class, she was more conflicted and more interesting because she existed philosophically between Xavier and Magneto. She carried uncertainty, anger, vulnerability. There was genuine tension surrounding where she belonged and what she believed. By the time Apocalypse arrives, though, the movie suddenly presents her as this legendary mutant freedom fighter admired by younger mutants from a distance. They look at her almost like she's become a symbolic revolutionary figure, and it feels rushed. Or maybe unearned is the more accurate word. you can clearly feel the franchise adjusting itself around Jennifer Lawrence becoming one of the biggest stars in Hollywood during that era. After the Hunger Games exploded commercially, Mystique gradually shifted closer and closer toward becoming the franchise's central protagonist figure, because Jennifer Lawrence had become the biggest name in the cast. Hollywood does this constantly. Franchises naturally reorganize themselves around whoever becomes the breakout star. The issue is that the character herself never fully evolves into that leadership role organically. So you end up with this strange disconnect, where the movie repeatedly insists Mystique is the inspirational heart of the X-Men, while the emotional groundwork supporting that transformation feels underdeveloped. Especially for audiences familiar with the comics, where Mystique traditionally exists as a much more morally unpredictable figure and nowhere near the straightforward heroic leader this film sometimes wants her to become. And honestly, Jennifer Lawrence herself occasionally looks unconvinced by the direction too. That sounds harsher than I intend it to, because she's still a talented performer, and there are scenes where she works perfectly well in the role. But compared to Michael Fassbender or James McAvoy, who still feel deeply emotionally connected to their characters, Lawrence occasionally comes across like someone balancing between fully investing in the material and simply completing another major franchise installment. There's also the unavoidable issue that the later films became increasingly reluctant to keep her in full Mystique form for extended stretches, which creates this unintentionally amusing situation where Mystique's mutant ability slowly evolves into looking like Jennifer Lawrence for most of the runtime. And once you notice it, it becomes difficult not to keep noticing it throughout these later installments. It changes the character's visual identity too. Earlier versions of Mystique felt dangerous, mysterious, unpredictable. In Apocalypse, she feels more approachable, more grounded, more conventionally heroic. Again, that direction is not inherently flawed on its own. It just doesn't always feel like the same character anymore. That said, some of her quieter scenes genuinely work for me. Her interactions with Nightcrawler have warmth to them. She brings emotional stability to the younger mutants early in the film. Certain moments carry an almost older sister energy that I actually found effective. And structurally, I understand why the movie pushes her into this leadership position. Xavier spends portions of the story withdrawn and uncertain. Magneto is descending into darkness once again. The younger team needs someone active to rally around. On paper, it makes sense. Emotionally, though, I never felt the film fully earned the mythology it builds around her. And strangely, that becomes yet another example of Apocalypse struggling with scale. The movie repeatedly elevates characters into larger-than-life symbolic roles before properly developing them into those positions first. Mystique isn't the only example of that issue, but she's probably the clearest one, because underneath all the speeches, heroic framing, and inspirational symbolism, she still feels like a character the franchise itself hasn't completely figured out yet. So let's talk about Apocalypse himself, because this is where the movie truly becomes divisive, and honestly, I feel a little bad for Oscar Isaac here. Seriously. Because beneath all of that makeup and prosthetic design is one of the strongest actors working today, and you can clearly tell he's trying. He commits to the deep vocal delivery, the slow, controlled movement, the ancient god physicality, all of it. He commits to the role far more than people sometimes acknowledge, but the film gives him an incredibly difficult character to make truly compelling. First off, visually, yes, this design received a tremendous amount of criticism when the trailers first released, and honestly, I still understand why. There's no easy way around the fact that Apocalypse occasionally resembles less of an unstoppable ancient mutant and more of a villain pulled from a forgotten science fiction production from the late 1990s. The heavy blue armor, the dense prosthetics, the altered vocal effects, sometimes the design works in isolated still images, but once the character is moving on-screen, it can start feeling strangely stiff. And the problem with placing an actor as expressive as Oscar Isaac beneath that much makeup is that you inevitably lose a huge amount of emotional subtlety. His face can barely communicate nuanced reactions half the time. So Apocalypse ends up feeling emotionally distant, even during scenes where the film desperately wants him to come across as persuasive, intimidating, or godlike. Which becomes an even larger issue once you realize the character himself isn't written with much complexity either. Because after all the build-up surrounding him as the first mutant, this ancient mythological figure worshipped across civilizations, his actual motivation essentially comes down to humanity becoming weak and corrupt. Therefore, civilization must be destroyed and rebuilt. And that's mostly it. Now, simple motivations can absolutely work when the character possesses enough presence and emotional gravity. Avengers, Infinity War simplified Thanos down to a fairly direct ideology too. But Apocalypse never receives enough emotional or philosophical texture to elevate him beyond familiar, world-ending antagonist territory. He mostly moves through scenes delivering speeches about survival, evolution, and power, while entire cities collapse behind him. There are glimpses of more interesting ideas hidden underneath the surface. The notion that Apocalypse sees himself not as evil, but as a necessary force of evolution, that's compelling. The idea that he specifically seeks out emotionally damaged mutants and offers them purpose, also compelling, but the movie never explores those concepts deeply enough to give them real dramatic weight. And honestly, the increasingly undefined nature of his powers doesn't help either. One moment he's transferring consciousness between bodies, then he's manipulating matter, then enlarging physically, then generating force fields, then amplifying the abilities of other mutants, then surviving almost anything imaginable. Eventually, he stops feeling dangerous in a specific or emotionally tangible way and instead becomes, whatever the plot currently requires, powerful. Ironically, that actually lowers the tension rather than increasing it, because the more limitless he becomes, the harder it is to emotionally connect with the conflict itself. There's no clear vulnerability, no real psychological complexity beyond domination and destruction. He isn't manipulative enough to feel unsettling. He isn't charismatic enough to genuinely hypnotize followers. He isn't emotionally layered enough to become tragic. He's just there, constantly speaking about cleansing the world. And that's frustrating because the concept of Apocalypse should have been extraordinary for an X-Men film. This is supposed to be a legendary mutant, a figure whose existence predates modern civilization itself, the kind of antagonist capable of shaking the ideological foundation of the entire franchise. Instead, he often feels like another ultimate threat, blockbuster villain who arrived simply because the sequel required larger stakes. Even the Horsemen dynamic suffers because of that. Magneto works because Magneto already possessed emotional depth long before Apocalypse entered the story. Storm and Angel mostly feel recruited because the movie needed recognizable characters standing behind him visually. And the strange part is that despite all these issues, I don't actually think Apocalypse is completely ineffective. There are moments where Isaac's performance genuinely cuts through the limitations. Certain quieter scenes where he observes humanity or speaks directly with Magneto carry some real weight to them. Occasionally, the film captures this eerie feeling of an ancient being trying to interpret the modern world after centuries beneath history. Those smaller flashes almost make you imagine a much stronger version of the character existing inside a different screenplay, but the movie repeatedly pulls him back toward large-scale spectacle instead. By the final act, Apocalypse barely feels like a character anymore. He feels more like the center of a massive digital effects event, and honestly, that's probably the biggest disappointment surrounding him overall. Not that he lacks power, he obviously doesn't, but that he somehow becomes strangely forgettable despite being positioned as the single greatest threat the franchise had ever introduced, one of the strongest ideas inside X-Men. Apocalypse is the concept of the Four Horsemen. On paper, that setup is instantly compelling. Apocalypse traveling across the world recruiting damaged, isolated, emotionally vulnerable mutants to become enhanced agents of destruction. That absolutely sounds like the foundation for something epic, and for a while, the movie almost convinces you it's going to fully deliver on that idea, because the Horsemen aren't supposed to function as random bodyguards. They're meant to represent different forms of pain, alienation, and disillusionment. That's exactly why Magneto works so effectively within this storyline. Apocalypse doesn't recruit him through promises of power. He reaches Eric at the precise moment where his faith in humanity collapses again. There's emotional vulnerability underneath the recruitment. Apocalypse identifies a broken man and weaponizes his grief. That's classic X-Men storytelling. Storm works from that perspective too, at least conceptually. She's young, surviving alone on the streets, stealing to survive, already disconnected from the society around her. You can understand why someone presenting himself as an all-powerful mutant savior would appeal to her emotionally. And Alexandra's ship gives Storm a guarded energy early on that hints at a much more layered character than the movie ultimately explores. But once you move beyond those examples, the Horseman dynamic starts feeling rushed very quickly. Angel especially is where the film begins losing me. Apocalypse is supposedly selecting the strongest and most worthy mutants on Earth, yet Angel's introduction basically amounts to losing a cage fight and looking emotionally defeated afterward. Apocalypse arrives as though he's assembling some legendary mutant force, while portions of the recruitment process feel strangely close to random encounters inside a role-playing game. Emotionally unstable, perfect. Welcome to the team. Psylocke runs into a similar problem. Olivia Munn absolutely looks the part, honestly, probably one of the most visually comic-accurate character designs in the entire movie, but the character barely receives enough dialogue to establish who she actually is beyond standing beside Apocalypse looking dangerous. If you already know Psylocke from the comics, you naturally fill in the missing depth yourself. If you don't, she mostly comes across as the woman in purple armor with the psychic sword, and that becomes the larger issue with the Horsemen overall. Visually memorable, emotionally underdeveloped, the movie keeps introducing potentially fascinating dynamics, then immediately rushing toward the next major plot point before any of them have room to fully develop. There's barely any time spent exploring what these characters genuinely think about Apocalypse beyond broad loyalty. Are they manipulated, inspired, desperate, brainwashed, some combination of all four? The film brushes against those ideas constantly without ever truly exploring them, which becomes frustrating because the Horsemen should have formed the emotional foundation of the conflict itself. Imagine if the movie slowed down and genuinely explored Apocalypse targeting mutants abandoned by society. Imagine if Storm sincerely believed Apocalypse represented liberation for mutant kind. Imagine if Angel's resentment and self-hatred were pushed further emotionally. Imagine if Psylocke had an actual ideological connection to Apocalypse instead of mostly standing silently beside him, looking visually impressive. There's enormous potential inside the premise itself. Instead, the Horsemen largely end up functioning as enhanced mini-bosses the X-Men eventually need to defeat. And the strange part is that the movie almost seems aware of this imbalance itself. That's exactly why Magneto dominates so much of the emotional focus. He's the only Horseman whose loyalty genuinely feels earned on a psychological level. When Eric stands beside Apocalypse, you understand the grief and emotional devastation that brought him there. Even when his later actions become increasingly extreme, the emotional progression still makes sense. The others never fully receive that same depth. Storm comes the closest, but even she feels like the film is postponing most of her meaningful development for future installments that ultimately never materialized in the way audiences expected. Angel barely leaves an impression beyond the physical transformation Apocalypse gives him. Psylocke remains visually striking, but emotionally distant for almost the entire runtime. And honestly, there's also a slightly amusing imbalance within the team itself. Magneto feels like a genuinely terrifying Omega-level force capable of reshaping the world. Meanwhile, the others occasionally feel like Apocalypse recruited whoever happened to be nearby while wandering through Cairo. That sounds harsher than I intend it to, but the movie never completely establishes why these four specifically are destined to become the legendary Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Still, I can't fully dislike the concept, because visually and structurally, it does create some of the film's strongest imagery. Seeing these characters transformed, amplified, standing together while civilization begins collapsing around them undeniably carries a powerful comic book energy. You can feel the movie reaching for something mythic and biblical in scale. It simply needed stronger character writing beneath the spectacle, because by the end, the Horsemen remain memorable more for their designs and abilities than for who they actually are as people. Alright, let's be honest for a second. When most audiences remember X-Men, Apocalypse, they remember Quicksilver, not Apocalypse, not the final confrontation, not the massive world-ending narrative. They remember the mansion explosion sequence. And honestly, that reaction is completely understandable, because somehow in the middle of this enormous overloaded superhero film, there's one sequence that suddenly becomes creative, funny, visually inventive, emotionally satisfying, and genuinely joyful all at once. It's almost like the movie accidentally shifts into a completely different energy for 5 minutes and suddenly remembers exactly what makes superhero storytelling exciting. The moment the mansion explodes and time slows down, the entire film transforms. And what's fascinating is that this scene could have very easily felt repetitive after X-Men, Days of Future Past. The kitchen sequence in that movie became iconic almost immediately. Audiences loved it. So returning to another elaborate Quicksilver slow-motion sequence could have easily come across as the franchise repeating itself simply because the first one was successful. But somehow it still works, mostly because the filmmakers clearly understand why audiences connected with Quicksilver in the first place. It isn't just the slow motion itself, it's the personality underneath it. Evan Peters plays Quicksilver with this chaotic, effortless confidence that instantly lightens every scene he enters. He's funny without feeling aggressively engineered as the comedy character. There's a natural looseness to his performance that contrasts perfectly against how serious and emotionally heavy the rest of the film becomes. And the mansion rescue sequence is basically the ideal showcase for that energy. The way he casually reacts to complete catastrophe as though it's merely a mild inconvenience, grabbing pizza while the building detonates around him, moving students inch by inch through collapsing debris, adjusting tiny details nobody else would ever notice because, from his perspective, the entire world is almost frozen in place. It's such an intelligent way of visualizing super speed. More importantly, though, the sequence actually has emotional warmth to it. That's the aspect people sometimes overlook. Quicksilver isn't fighting someone here, he's saving people. Students, teachers, innocent lives trapped inside a disaster. There's something genuinely uplifting about the sequence despite the destruction surrounding it. For a brief moment, the movie stops being about annihilation and becomes about rescue instead. Preservation rather than devastation. And honestly, that's why the scene connects emotionally, while so much of the larger digital destruction later in the film doesn't. The action has a clear human center. It also helps that the visual choreography is exceptional, tiny details everywhere, bodies suspended in midair, water bending around movement, small reactions stretched across impossible speed. The entire sequence carries this playful creativity that reminds you superhero powers can actually be imaginative and entertaining, rather than existing purely for destruction. And the Eurythmics track layered over the scene is honestly a perfect choice. It gives the sequence rhythm and personality without making it feel overly edited or desperately eager to appear stylish. What's almost hilarious, though, is how completely Quicksilver hijacks the movie afterward, because once that sequence ends, the film never quite reaches that same level again. You can genuinely feel it happen. The energy spikes massively during the mansion rescue. Audiences become fully invested again, and then the story has to transition back into apocalypse monologues and giant clouds of gray destruction. That's a difficult shift to recover from. Quicksilver steals the film so effectively that everything after him inevitably feels slightly less interesting by comparison. And Evan Peters clearly understands exactly what kind of movie he's in, which is part of why the performance works so well. While everyone else is carrying the burden of destiny, extinction, betrayal, ancient mythology, mutant superiority, and endless emotional trauma, Quicksilver simply feels human, awkward, impulsive, slightly immature, but human. Even his quieter moments land because of that. There's a scene where he almost tells Magneto the truth about being his son, and underneath the humor, you suddenly catch this small glimpse of vulnerability. It's brief, but it matters. The film could have very easily reduced him to the funny speedster, but Peters adds just enough sincerity beneath the humor to make him feel like an actual person. And honestly, if you look at audience reactions over the years, Quicksilver probably became the clearest representation of what viewers wanted more of from these newer X-Men films. Personality, creativity, character-driven power sequences, less endless apocalypse imagery, more memorable mutant moments. Because years later, people still talk specifically about the mansion rescue sequence. Not because it's the largest action set piece, but because it's the one moment where Apocalypse fully remembers how to be entertaining without losing emotional connection at the same time. At a certain point during X-Men, Apocalypse, the movie basically pauses and says, "Would you like to see Wolverine again?" And honestly, the audience reaction probably explains exactly why the scene exists. Because the moment Hugh Jackman appears as Weapon X, the entire theater suddenly wakes up again. It doesn't matter how overloaded the plot has become or how crowded the movie feels by that stage. The second Wolverine arrives, everyone immediately pays attention. It's almost unfair, honestly. You spend 2 hours establishing Apocalypse as the greatest threat in mutant history, and then Hugh Jackman runs through a hallway for 3 minutes and somehow becomes one of the most memorable parts of the entire film. That's star power. Now, to be fair, the actual Weapon X sequence is genuinely effective. It's intense, chaotic, and far more aggressive than these PG-13 X-Men films usually allow themselves to become. Wolverine tearing through soldiers inside the facility carries this raw, feral energy that instantly changes the tone of the movie. The claws feel dangerous again. People aren't simply being thrown across rooms. Wolverine is tearing through the environment with terrifying efficiency. And honestly, part of why the sequence works so well is because it's simple. No massive speeches, no apocalypse mythology, no monologues about evolution and destiny, just Wolverine unleashed inside a nightmare laboratory while alarms echo through the corridors. There's a directness to it that much of the surrounding film occasionally lacks. You can also feel the movie leaning heavily into audience nostalgia throughout those sequences. The Weapon X imagery, the escape corridors, the fractured memory flashes. Even the way the younger mutants react to him, Every element is designed to trigger recognition. And to be fair, it absolutely works. Hugh Jackman had carried the emotional identity of the X-Men franchise for so long by that point that seeing him again instantly reconnects the film to the earlier era in a very direct way. At the same time, though, I completely understand the argument that the cameo contributes almost nothing to the actual narrative structure, because structurally, you could remove Wolverine from the movie entirely and the core plot barely changes at all. That's the strange thing about the sequence. It's undeniably exciting while it's happening, but it also feels like the film temporarily transforms into a different movie simply to deliver a surge of audience excitement before returning to Apocalypse. And maybe that's why reactions to the cameo remain somewhat divided. Some viewers love it because it's genuinely thrilling in the moment. Others see it as the movie borrowing emotional momentum from a more beloved character because the main antagonist isn't generating enough weight on his own. Honestly, both interpretations are probably true. And if we're being completely honest, the fact that Wolverine's cameo overshadows Apocalypse at all probably isn't the best sign for the film overall. Because this isn't even fully realized Logan-era Wolverine. He barely speaks. He essentially functions like a horror film creature sprinting through hallways, and yet the energy of the movie immediately spikes the second he appears. That says a lot about how emotionally invested audiences already were in Jackman compared to the newer mythology the film was trying to establish. There's also something unintentionally amusing about how casually the movie inserts him into the story. Oh, by the way, Weapon X is here. That concept alone could have supported an entire film. Instead, it's treated almost like a side mission the younger mutants accidentally stumble into before continuing the Apocalypse storyline. Again, effective sequence, but also slightly bizarre when you step back and think about it structurally. Still, I can't pretend I didn't enjoy it. The scene has momentum. It's memorable. It injects the film with intensity at exactly the point where the pacing starts slowing down. And visually, seeing Wolverine unleashed in full berserker mode inside that facility delivers something longtime X-Men audiences had wanted to properly experience on-screen for years. But it's impossible to ignore what the cameo represents underneath the excitement too, because beneath all the adrenaline, there's this lingering feeling that X-Men, Apocalypse never fully trusts its own new generation of characters yet. The movie keeps circling back toward familiar icons, Wolverine, Magneto, Xavier, because those are still the figures carrying the strongest emotional connection for audiences. And when the biggest crowd-pleasing moment in your new era, X-Men film, belongs to a brief appearance from the old guard, that says a lot about where the franchise stood emotionally at that point. One thing I'll absolutely give X-Men Apocalypse credit for is its cast. Even people who strongly dislike the film usually acknowledge there are actors here doing genuine heavy lifting trying to keep the entire movie emotionally grounded. And honestly, without several key performances, I think this film completely collapses. Michael Fassbender is the obvious standout once again. At this point, he essentially understood Magneto instinctively, but not in a disengaged or automatic way. More like he knew exactly how much pain, anger, grief, and exhaustion to bring into every scene without ever pushing the performance too far. Even when the script becomes increasingly excessive around him, Fassbender somehow keeps Eric emotionally believable. And that's not easy in a movie where ancient mutants are tearing continents apart. James McAvoy also deserves enormous credit because he's carrying a very different kind of emotional responsibility in this film. Xavier's role isn't as explosively dramatic as Magneto's here, but McAvoy still gives the character warmth and patience that keeps him feeling human. Even when the movie becomes buried beneath spectacle, you still believe Charles is someone desperately trying to hold on to empathy inside a world that continually rewards violence instead. And honestly, the scenes between McAvoy and Fassbender still carry more emotional weight than almost anything connected directly to Apocalypse himself. You can feel years of history between them without the movie constantly needing to explain it aloud. Their relationship essentially became the emotional backbone of these prequel films. Then there's Evan Peters, who honestly may have understood the assignment better than almost anyone else involved. He clearly recognized that Quicksilver needed to inject energy into the film rather than additional heaviness. His performance carries this chaotic charm that never feels overly engineered. He's funny, but not in that hyperactive blockbuster style, where every line sounds manufactured specifically for trailers and internet clips. He just feels naturally awkward and entertaining. Sophie Turner as Jean Grey is interesting because you can clearly see the movie planting seeds for something larger with the character. She isn't given an enormous emotional range to explore here, but she effectively sells Jean's instability and restraint. There's this ongoing sense that Jean is constantly trying to contain something beneath the surface, and Turner lanes into that uneasiness well. I don't think the screenplay fully develops her yet, but she accomplishes what the movie requires from her. Cody Smith-McPhee honestly surprised me as Nightcrawler too. He brings warmth into the role almost immediately. The character could very easily have drifted into irritating comic relief territory, but there's sincerity underneath the awkwardness that keeps him genuinely likable. Nervous energy, hesitant humor, kindness. He actually feels like someone who belongs inside Xavier's school. Nicholas Hoult is a slightly strange case because Beast doesn't receive especially strong material here, yet Hoult remains consistently solid regardless. He's one of those actors who quietly grounds scenes even when the film itself starts drifting into chaos around him. Now on the other side of things, yes, some performances definitely suffer because of the movie's overcrowding issues. Olivia Munn's Psylocke looks fantastic visually, honestly one of the most comic-accurate character designs in the entire franchise, but the role barely receives enough dialogue to establish an actual personality. It's difficult to fairly evaluate a performance when the screenplay mostly asks you to stand in the background, looking intimidating for long stretches. Alexandra Shipp's Storm has flashes where you can absolutely see potential too, especially in the earlier sections of the movie, but again the film rarely slows down long enough to genuinely explore her emotionally. Same issue with Angel, same issue with Jubilee, too many characters, not enough breathing room. Jennifer Lawrence is probably the most divisive performance in the film though, and honestly I understand both sides of that conversation. Because there are scenes where she's genuinely good, but there are also scenes where she visibly seems exhausted by the franchise at this stage. Compared to McAvoy or Fassbender, who still appear deeply emotionally invested in their characters, Lawrence occasionally feels detached from the material unfolding around her. Maybe that emotional distance is intentional for Mystique, maybe it isn't. Either way, audiences noticed it. Then there's Oscar Isaac, which honestly becomes one of the most difficult performances in the film to evaluate because so much of it disappears underneath prosthetics, makeup, vocal effects, and restrictive costume design. You can tell he's trying to inject presence into Apocalypse, but the movie repeatedly buries the human dimension of the performance underneath layers of ancient god-villain presentation. And honestly, I think that becomes the recurring theme with this cast overall. There's more talent here than the movie fully knows how to use. That's what makes Apocalypse frustrating rather than completely disastrous. You constantly catch glimpses of stronger performances, stronger character dynamics, and stronger emotional material trying to emerge through all the noise. Sometimes those stronger elements break through brilliantly for a scene or two. Other times they're immediately swallowed by the next large-scale apocalypse sequence. But the cast consistently keeps the movie watchable even when the narrative itself starts losing balance. And in a blockbuster this overloaded, that matters enormously. Whatever problems X-Men, Apocalypse has, and there are quite a few, the movie is almost never visually dull. Overwhelming at times, absolutely, but visually lifeless. Not really. Bryan Singer and the effects team clearly wanted this film to feel enormous. Not restrained, not grounded, not subtle. Enormous. And from the opening Egypt prologue onward, the movie constantly pushes scale toward the audience. Collapsing pyramids, cities tearing themselves apart, psychic landscapes, magnetic devastation, exploding mansions, bodies crashing through walls. The entire film operates in a near-constant state of something massive is happening. And honestly, there are moments where that ambition genuinely works. The opening sequence carries a mythological atmosphere that I actually really like. It feels ancient, ceremonial, dusty. There's texture in those early scenes. Some of the Cairo material later in the film works similarly. Occasionally, the movie captures this surreal comic book energy that feels visually distinct from the cleaner, more polished aesthetic dominating many superhero films during that era. You can tell Singer wanted mutant abilities to feel expressive rather than merely functional, and when the movie focuses on individual powers, it's often at its strongest visually. Quicksilver obviously receives the standout showcase, but even smaller moments land effectively. Magneto bending entire environments around himself still looks impressive. Nightcrawler's teleportation effects remain visually engaging without becoming distracting. Jean's psychic moments carry this eerie instability. Even Cyclops' optic blasts feel heavier and more dangerous here than they did in several earlier films. There's genuine imagination in the way the powers are presented. The problem is that the movie gradually becomes addicted to escalation, and once it begins escalating, it never really stops. By the second half, entire cities are collapsing into floating clouds of debris, while Apocalypse gestures dramatically like he's conducting the end of civilization itself. Buildings fold inward, landmarks disintegrate. Massive shockwaves tear across environments, and after a while, your eyes almost begin glazing over because the movie keeps bombarding the audience with destruction nonstop. It's the classic blockbuster issue where larger visuals don't automatically create larger emotional impact. Sometimes the opposite happens. The more digital chaos fills the screen, the less tangible the danger starts feeling. There are moments late in the film where so much debris and computer-generated destruction is flying around that the scenes begin losing physical weight entirely. Characters stop feeling like people existing inside environments and start feeling like actors standing in front of visual effects backdrops. And honestly, that green screen fatigue affects Apocalypse harder than several earlier X-Men films, because one thing those older movies occasionally understood well was restraint. Even with all the mutant abilities, there was still a grounded quality to the action. Here, the film fully embraces giant spectacle mode, which sometimes creates incredible imagery, and other times feels like watching digital rubble collide with more digital rubble for 15 straight minutes. Still, I do think the production design deserves genuine credit. The movie has this gritty, almost grimy visual texture in places that separates it from shinier superhero films. Apocalypse's environments feel ancient and oppressive. Cerebro still carries this eerie, dreamlike atmosphere whenever it appears. Even the costumes, divisive as some of them are, at least attempt a more comic book-inspired aesthetic compared to the black leather era of the early X-Men movies. And honestly, I appreciate that the film occasionally allows itself to become slightly ridiculous visually. There's a comic book insanity running through parts of this movie that I almost admire. Giant psychic confrontations inside mental landscapes, purple energy storms, ancient mutant gods enhancing followers through celestial-looking power transfers. It's absurd. But at least it's embracing the weirdness of X-Men mythology instead of trying to pretend mutants are entirely realistic. The real issue is balance, because when every scene is attempting to feel gigantic, eventually nothing stands out anymore. The visual overload starts flattening itself. That's why the smaller moments, Quicksilver saving students, Magneto quietly manipulating metal in confined spaces, Nightcrawler teleporting through chaos, often leave stronger impressions than the massive destruction sequences. Those scenes have clarity, and honestly, that's probably the best way to describe Apocalypse visually overall. A movie filled with striking imagery that occasionally loses sight of what actually matters inside the spectacle. When the visuals are tied directly to character or emotion, they can be genuinely fantastic. When they exist purely to make the movie feel bigger, they begin blending together into noise. But even then, I can't deny the film swings hard visually, sometimes too hard, but at least it swings. The action in X-Men, Apocalypse is honestly a perfect reflection of the movie itself. Some of it is genuinely exciting. Some of it becomes visually exhausting. And a lot of it depends entirely on whether there's an actual emotional hook underneath all the explosions. Because when the film locks into a clear idea for an action sequence, it can absolutely deliver. The mansion explosion sequence obviously receives most of the attention, deservedly so, but there are other moments throughout the movie that work really well too. Magneto unleashing his abilities after joining Apocalypse still carries impact. Nightcrawler teleporting through combat creates great movement and momentum. Cyclops finally fully unleashing his optic blasts gives the character more physical presence than he's had in years. Even some of the smaller fights carry this scrappy comic book energy that I genuinely enjoyed. The Weapon X escape sequence is another strong example. It's chaotic, aggressive, fast, almost horror-like in certain moments. You genuinely feel Wolverine tearing through the facility. The action there has clarity and intensity. And honestly, that's something the movie occasionally loses once the scale becomes too enormous. Because by the time we arrive at the final battle, Apocalypse has fully entered, everyone fire powers at the sky simultaneously territory. And look, parts of the climax are undeniably cool. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Watching the younger mutants finally fight together carries real payoff. Their satisfaction in seeing Jean, Cyclops, Nightcrawler, Beast, Mystique, all of them finally functioning like an actual X-Men team instead of isolated characters trapped inside separate subplots. That emotional idea works. The problem is that the environment surrounding them becomes increasingly chaotic. The climax basically transforms into a storm of collapsing structures, floating debris, psychic confrontations, purple energy effects, teleportation flashes, magnetic destruction, sand explosions, and endless waves of digital dust. At a certain point, the movie stops feeling like a battle and starts feeling like the visual effects department stress-testing every computer in the building. And strangely, the larger the climax becomes visually, the less personal it starts feeling emotionally. That's exactly why Magneto's earlier scenes land harder than large portions of the finale. Those scenes have focus. During the climax, most of the characters are essentially standing inside giant destruction clouds, trying to overpower Apocalypse from different directions. Still, there are flashes where the final act almost reaches the emotional scale it's aiming for. Jean Grey's major moment is the clearest example. The movie had been teasing the Phoenix side of Jean throughout the runtime, and when she finally unleashes her full power during the climax, the film briefly taps into something genuinely exciting. Sophie Turner suddenly brings this eerie confidence into the character that Jean hadn't fully displayed before, and visually the moment actually feels mythic in the way the movie always wanted Apocalypse himself to feel. That's one of the rare instances where the giant scale and emotional payoff finally align properly. You also get strong team dynamics scattered throughout the battle itself, Nightcrawler rescuing people through chaos, Cyclops learning to trust his abilities more fully, Xavier refusing to abandon his belief in empathy and connection even when facing someone like Apocalypse. There is emotional material inside the climax. It isn't empty. It's just buried beneath an enormous amount of visual noise. And honestly, that's probably why reactions to the finale remain so divided depending on the viewer. Some audiences see an epic comic book showdown filled with huge powers and non-stop spectacle. Others see 2 hours of build-up collapsing into another overloaded digital effects climax where the emotional stakes disappear underneath destruction. And honestly, I understand both reactions. Because visually, the climax absolutely commits to its ambition. You can't accuse the movie of playing things safely. Bryan Singer throws everything imaginable at the screen during those final 30 minutes. Massive psychic landscapes, cities collapsing, amplified mutant powers, full team attacks. The movie is desperately trying to feel like the definitive X-Men event, but somewhere inside all that chaos, it also starts losing intimacy. And the strange thing is that the film occasionally hints at a better approach itself. Some of the strongest action moments in the movie aren't actually the loudest ones. Quicksilver saving students, Magneto quietly manipulating metal through grief, Wolverine escaping the laboratory. Those moments stay memorable because they're directly tied to character emotion and perspective. The final battle occasionally forgets that. Still, I can't honestly say I was bored during the climax. Overstimulated? Absolutely. Occasionally disconnected? Definitely. But bored? Not really. The film has enough energy, enough movement, and enough visual ambition to keep pulling your attention forward even when it becomes messy. And honestly, that's probably X-Men, Apocalypse in a nutshell as an action film. It constantly reaches for epic scale. Sometimes it lands beautifully. Sometimes it completely overwhelms itself trying to get there. I think the biggest issue the movie ultimately runs into bigger than the villain problems, bigger than the timeline inconsistencies, bigger than the visual effects overload, is that it simply tries to carry too much at once. This movie is packed. And I don't just mean a lot happens. I mean the film constantly feels like it's balancing 15 different storylines, emotional arcs, character introductions, callbacks, setup scenes, franchise obligations, and world-ending spectacle simultaneously. You can genuinely feel the strain increasing as the runtime continues. What's interesting is that the pacing doesn't begin badly at all. Early on, the movie actually moves with purpose. You're shifting between Magneto and Poland, Apocalypse awakening, Xavier's school, Scott discovering his powers, Mystique rescuing Nightcrawler. There's variety and momentum to it. The film feels busy in an engaging way. Then gradually, almost without noticing at first, the movie starts becoming heavier. More characters arrive, more exposition piles up, more storylines require attention. Suddenly the film isn't just introducing Jean and Cyclops anymore. It's also juggling Apocalypse mythology, Horsemen recruitment, Magneto's grief, Mystique's leadership role, government reactions, Wolverine cameos, psychic kidnappings, global destruction, Xavier reconnecting with Moira, Storm's recruitment, Psylocke standing in the background trying to look intimidating. It just keeps stacking elements on top of each other. And because there are so many moving pieces, very few of them receive enough space to fully develop. That's the frustrating part. You can actually see multiple stronger movies trapped inside Apocalypse. There's a genuinely compelling Magneto drama hidden in here. There's a fun, next-generation learning to become the X-Men story hidden in here. There's even a darker psychological Apocalypse film buried underneath all the spectacle. But the movie never fully commits to any single direction. Instead, it constantly cuts away toward the next subplot before scenes can land emotionally. Characters experience interesting moments and then disappear for long stretches. Emotional developments happen so quickly that some relationships barely feel established, before the movie expects the audience to care deeply about them. Storm is a perfect example. She's introduced with real potential, recruited by Apocalypse almost immediately afterward, and then mostly exists as part of the Horsemen lineup without enough individual focus to create a stronger emotional connection. Same with Angel, same with Psylocke. Even Jean and Cyclops, who receive considerably more attention, still feel like characters the film is rushing through rather than fully developing. And strangely, the overcrowding even affects the action itself, because once every character needs their own moment, the movie starts jumping constantly between different powers, different confrontations, and different emotional beats. Sometimes that rhythm works. Other times the film feels like it's rapidly cycling through scenes simply to ensure everybody technically receives screen time. There's also this structural problem, where the movie spends a very long time setting things up, yet somehow still feels underdeveloped. Which is honestly impressive in a strange way. The runtime pushes nearly 2.5 hours, yet portions of the narrative still feel rushed. Usually that means the issue isn't a lack of time, it's a lack of focus. And honestly, I think that's exactly what happened here. The screenplay wants to be an apocalypse epic, an origin story for younger X-Men, a Magneto tragedy, a franchise relaunch, a giant spectacle blockbuster, a mythology expansion, and a nostalgic reunion piece simultaneously. That's an incredibly difficult balancing act for any film. Eventually, the pacing starts suffering because of it. The middle section especially becomes somewhat bogged down. You can feel the movie repositioning pieces into place instead of naturally flowing from one event to another. Some scenes exist primarily to explain mythology or establish future action, and the momentum gradually slows beneath the weight of all that exposition. At the same time, the movie paradoxically rushes through emotional transitions. Characters change allegiances quickly. Relationships are implied more than explored. Apocalypse recruits people in scenes that sometimes last only a few minutes before the film has already moved on toward the next plotline. There's almost never enough stillness, and honestly, I think that's exactly why the Quicksilver sequence stands out so powerfully. For one brief stretch, the movie simplifies itself completely. One location, one objective, one perspective. Suddenly the film feels focused again. Meanwhile, the larger structure keeps drifting closer and closer toward overload. The strange part is that I don't even think Apocalypse becomes unwatchable because of these issues. Messy? Absolutely. Bloated? Definitely. But there's still enough energy and enough genuinely strong individual moments to keep pulling you through the experience. The movie rarely fully collapses beneath its own weight. It just constantly feels like it's standing right on the edge of doing so. And by the end, you're left with this strange sensation where you remember dozens of scenes, dozens of characters, dozens of ideas, but not necessarily one strong central story binding all of them together cleanly. One of the strangest things about X-Men, Apocalypse, is how emotionally inconsistent it feels from scene to scene, sometimes not even scene to scene, moment to moment. The film constantly bounces between genuinely dark material and playful comic book energy without always figuring out how to blend the two naturally. And occasionally, the tonal whiplash becomes genuinely strange. Because when you really stop and think about it, this is actually a fairly grim film. Magneto loses his family in front of him. Entire cities collapse. Apocalypse speaks openly about erasing civilization and rebuilding it from the ashes. There are sequences involving mass casualties, psychological manipulation, public panic, endangered children. On paper, this should feel emotionally heavy. Not hopeless necessarily, but heavy, and sometimes it absolutely does. Magneto's storyline especially carries genuine emotional weight because the movie finally slows down long enough to let pain exist without immediately interrupting it. Michael Fassbender communicates grief so effectively that portions of his storyline almost feel like they belong to an entirely different film, a more restrained, emotionally grounded one. Then immediately afterward, the movie cuts toward a joke or a lighter comedic beat, and the emotional rhythm suddenly resets itself again. Now, to be fair, humor has always existed within X-Men stories. Even the earlier films contained lighter moments. The issue here is consistency. Some comedic beats work naturally because they emerge directly from personality. Quicksilver is the obvious example. Nightcrawler gets several genuinely charming moments too because his awkwardness feels sincere. But other jokes feel like they've been imported from a completely different movie. There are stretches where the film seems uncertain, whether it wants to be a mythological apocalypse story or a fun teenage superhero adventure. So it keeps attempting to do both simultaneously, and occasionally those tones collide in ways that feel awkward rather than seamless. The Return of the Jedi joke is a perfect example. It lands the first time because audiences instantly understand the meta commentary. the third movie is usually the weakest. But it's also such a modern, self-aware wink that it briefly pulls you completely out of the story. Suddenly, you're no longer thinking about the characters. You're thinking about franchise reputation and audience discourse. And Apocalypse does that multiple times. The emotional disconnect becomes even more noticeable during the large-scale destruction scenes. The movie constantly shows catastrophic global events unfolding, cities collapsing, landmarks disintegrating, millions of lives theoretically at risk, but emotionally it often feels strangely distant. Part of that comes from the fact that the destruction rarely stays grounded through ordinary human perspective. You see buildings crumble, dust clouds swallowing entire environments. Massive visual effects sequences happening everywhere simultaneously, but the film spends surprisingly little time showing how those events affect individual people. So instead of feeling horrifying, much of the destruction eventually becomes abstract spectacle. And honestly, I think that's exactly why the smaller moments land harder emotionally than the giant apocalypse imagery. Quicksilver saving students works because we see specific people in danger. Magneto's tragedy works because it's personal. Xavier and Eric arguing works because there's history between them. The emotional connection becomes weaker the larger the movie gets. Even some of the romantic and teenage dynamics feel underdeveloped because the pacing rarely allows relationships enough time to settle before the next major event explodes across the screen. Jean and Scott share moments together, but the movie moves so quickly that their connection feels more implied than deeply experienced. And then there's the emotional fatigue factor. Because once a film spends 2 straight hours escalating stakes continuously, eventually the audience's mind starts protecting itself emotionally. Not every scene can feel like the end of the world forever. At some point, viewers begin growing numb to it. Apocalypse occasionally falls directly into that trap. The movie constantly insists everything is catastrophic, yet the emotional experience of watching it sometimes becomes strangely flat rather than intense. Not boring exactly, just disconnected. And honestly, I think that's part of why reactions to the film vary so dramatically depending on the viewer. Some audiences get swept up in the spectacle and comic book energy enough that the tonal shifts never really bother them. Others keep waiting for the emotional core to fully lock into place and become frustrated when the film repeatedly interrupts itself. Because there is a genuinely strong emotional movie hidden inside this somewhere. You catch glimpses of it constantly. Xavier refusing to abandon compassion, Magneto drowning in grief, young mutants searching for belonging, Apocalypse manipulating loneliness and resentment. Those are good ideas, human ideas. But the film keeps surrounding those moments with so much noise, jokes, destruction, exposition, digital chaos, franchise setup, that it struggles to maintain emotional momentum consistently. And by the end, I think that's what leaves the movie feeling oddly hollow for some viewers despite how much technically happens within it. The film is loud, busy, emotional in bursts, but not always emotionally connected. What keeps X-Men Apocalypse from collapsing entirely into empty spectacle for me is that underneath all the destruction and visual chaos, there are still traces of the themes that always made X-Men compelling in the first place. The movie doesn't always explore them deeply enough, but they're there. At its core, this is still a story about people searching for belonging. That's always been the emotional engine of X-Men when the franchise works at its best. Mutants aren't simply superheroes. They're outsiders trying to figure out where they fit inside a world that fears them, exploits them, or wants to control them. And Apocalypse keeps returning to that idea through nearly every major character. Storm is isolated and surviving alone before Apocalypse finds her. Nightcrawler is literally being used as underground entertainment. Jean is afraid of what exists inside her. Scott can't even open his eyes safely without hurting people. Magneto tries hiding among humanity and loses everything again anyway. Even Apocalypse himself manipulates that loneliness. And honestly, that's one of the more interesting ideas the movie never fully explores deeply enough. Apocalypse doesn't recruit followers because they're evil. He recruits emotionally vulnerable people, angry people, disillusioned people, lost people. He finds mutants carrying pain and essentially tells them, the world rejected you because you're superior to it. And honestly, you can understand why certain characters would respond to that emotionally. That's exactly why Magneto's storyline works so well. Eric has spent multiple films trapped between Xavier's hope and his own rage toward humanity. By the time Apocalypse reaches him here, he's emotionally shattered enough to finally stop resisting the darker worldview entirely. And Xavier remains the complete opposite force. One thing I genuinely appreciate about James McAvoy's version of Charles is that even when the world repeatedly proves him wrong, he still refuses to abandon the idea of empathy and human connection. That's really the philosophical conflict underneath all the explosions. Apocalypse believes power and survival determine value. Xavier believes people survive because they need one another. The movie actually expresses that idea fairly directly near the end. Apocalypse stands alone despite all his power. Xavier survives because he's connected to people who genuinely care about him. It's a simple thematic idea, but honestly one of the few moments where the film's emotional message comes through clearly without being buried beneath spectacle. And I do think the younger mutants reinforce those themes too. Many of the school scenes work because they're fundamentally about frightened teenagers trying to find acceptance somewhere. That's why Xavier's mansion matters so much in these stories. It isn't just a headquarters for superhero training. It's a place where mutants can exist without apologizing for who they are. And occasionally, the movie captures that beautifully. There's also this recurring idea of manipulation through pain running throughout the entire film. Apocalypse keeps amplifying people's deepest emotional wounds. Magneto's grief, Storm's isolation, Angel's anger. He doesn't really build loyalty through trust or ideology. He weaponizes emotional damage. And honestly, that's probably the most unsettling aspect of Apocalypse conceptually, because the movie quietly suggests that people don't always join destructive movements because they're inherently monstrous. Sometimes they join because they're broken, isolated, and someone finally gives their pain a direction. That's actually a genuinely strong idea for a superhero film. The problem is that X-Men. Apocalypse constantly rushes past its own best themes. It introduces compelling emotional concepts and then immediately pivots back toward large-scale destruction before fully exploring them. You continuously feel the movie brushing against deeper material without slowing down long enough to fully unpack it. Even the theme of identity gets explored in interesting ways throughout the film. Mystique gradually hiding her true appearance less and less over time, Jean fearing the darker side of herself, Nightcrawler feeling ashamed of his appearance despite being one of the gentlest characters in the story, Scott learning to stop seeing his powers as a curse. That's all classic X-Men territory. And honestly, it's why this franchise works better than many generic superhero stories when it's operating at full strength. The powers usually reflect emotional conflict. The action matters more when it's tied to identity, fear, or belonging. Apocalypse understands that intellectually. I'm just not sure it always understands how to balance those ideas against the gigantic blockbuster scale it's chasing simultaneously. Still, I think the reason audiences continue debating this movie years later, instead of completely forgetting it, is because those thematic foundations are strong enough to keep breaking through the cracks. Even when the film becomes messy, overloaded, or emotionally uneven, there's still enough authentic X-Men DNA underneath everything to remind people why they connected with this franchise in the first place. One aspect I don't think X-Men Apocalypse receives enough credit for is the music. Not just the soundtrack selections, but the actual score itself. Because even when the movie becomes structurally messy, the music is doing a tremendous amount of emotional heavy lifting. John Ottman returning to score the film honestly helps more than people sometimes realize. There's this classic heroic sound woven throughout parts of the score that reconnects the movie emotionally to the earlier X-Men films again. And it isn't subtle background music either. Ottman leans heavily into emotion, large orchestral themes, dramatic crescendos, melancholy character motifs. The score constantly tries to give the film emotional weight and scale, even when the screenplay itself occasionally struggles to create that momentum on its own. And strangely, I think the music works best during the quieter scenes. Magneto's storyline especially benefits from it. There's this sadness running underneath Eric's scenes that the score amplifies beautifully without ever becoming manipulative. The same applies to some of Xavier's moments too. The music occasionally provides the film with emotional continuity that the pacing itself doesn't always maintain. Now, obviously, when most people discuss the music in Apocalypse, they're talking about Quicksilver. And honestly, fair enough. That sequence completely owns the movie musically. Using Sweet Dreams Are Made of This during the mansion explosion rescue is one of those soundtrack choices that instantly lodges itself into audience memory. The sequence already works visually, but the music gives it rhythm, personality, and emotional texture. It transforms the scene into something playful rather than merely technically impressive. And that matters because Quicksilver's sequences feel alive in a way much of the larger Apocalypse material doesn't. The song choice establishes that atmosphere immediately. And honestly, the movie understands something important there that it occasionally forgets elsewhere. Music can shape emotional tone faster than exposition ever can. The second Sweet Dreams begins playing, the the scene suddenly feels energetic, stylish, playful. The audience relaxes into it immediately. Compare that to some of the later apocalypse sequences where entire cities are collapsing, but the emotional mood feels strangely undefined. Now, not every musical choice works equally well. There are moments where the film becomes slightly too self-aware with its references. The 1980s soundtrack elements occasionally feel less like organic atmosphere and more like the movie nudging the audience and saying, "Remember what decade this is." And sometimes the needle drops feel almost overly obvious. The Four Horsemen cue is probably the clearest example. It's one of those moments where you can practically feel the movie congratulating itself for recognizing the reference opportunity. Not terrible, just slightly too direct. And honestly, that reflects the larger balancing act the movie struggles with overall. Sometimes the references genuinely add personality. Other times they feel included mainly because the film wants immediate audience recognition. The Return of the Jedi joke falls into that category for me too. It earned laughs because it's a clever meta-commentary on trilogies, but it also momentarily pulls you out of the film itself and reminds you that you're watching a franchise commenting on franchise culture. Still, I genuinely appreciate that Apocalypse at least attempts to develop a distinct musical identity. A lot of modern superhero films blur together sonically, the same trailer-style percussion, the same interchangeable orchestral noise, the same generic epic atmosphere. Ottman's work here actually feels melodic, emotional, occasionally even old-fashioned in the best possible way. You can actually remember parts of the score afterward, which honestly shouldn't feel rare in blockbuster filmmaking, but somehow increasingly does. And I think the soundtrack choices unintentionally reflect the movie's larger identity conflict in an interesting way too. Sometimes the film wants to be this mythological apocalypse epic with operatic emotional weight. Other times it wants to be a fun 1980s mutant adventure full of youthful energy and pop culture personality. The music constantly swings between those two modes, sometimes beautifully, sometimes awkwardly, but even when the movie itself starts losing focus, the soundtrack usually keeps trying to hold the emotional atmosphere together. And honestly, there are scenes in Apocalypse that would feel significantly flatter without Ottman's score carrying so much emotional momentum underneath them. Now, if you've never read an X-Men comic in your life, many of the adaptation choices in X-Men, Apocalypse probably won't bother you much at all. You'll simply experience it as another superhero story involving mutants, global destruction, impressive powers, and a giant blue antagonist speaking dramatically about evolution. But for longtime X-Men fans, yes, this movie sparked a lot of debate, because Apocalypse changes, compresses, rearranges, and outright rewrites quite a bit from the comics. Some of those changes work perfectly fine. Some feel understandable for a cinematic adaptation, and some genuinely left audiences confused. The clearest example is obviously Apocalypse himself. Comic book Apocalypse carries enormous presence. Not just physically, but philosophically too. He's intimidating because he completely believes survival through strength is the natural order of existence. There's this grand, almost biblical arrogance to him in the comics that makes him feel ancient, terrifying, and strangely intelligent at the same time. The movie constantly tells us this version possesses that same importance and power, but it never fully captures the same presence. A lot of longtime fans noticed that immediately, especially visually. And honestly, I understand why some audiences were disappointed by the design. Comic book Apocalypse feels imposing in a very specific way. Movie Apocalypse occasionally looks like Oscar Isaac became trapped inside an extremely expensive convention costume. That comparison appeared constantly after the trailers released, and honestly, it's difficult not to understand why. Then there's the Horsemen lineup. Now, to be fair, comic adaptations change team lineups constantly. That alone isn't automatically a problem, but fans definitely had mixed reactions seeing Storm, Magneto, Psylocke, and Angel grouped together as Apocalypse's chosen four horsemen. Some people liked the idea conceptually. Others felt like the movie selected recognizable characters first and worked backward toward the emotional logic afterward. Magneto works best because the film actually builds a believable emotional foundation around his recruitment. Storm works to a degree too if you lean into the broader themes of isolation, survival, and abandonment. But Angel and Psylocke mostly feel like they're there because the movie needed additional horsemen standing behind Apocalypse looking visually intimidating. Psylocke is especially interesting because visually she's probably one of the most comic-accurate characters in the entire film. Olivia Munn genuinely looks like Psylocke stepped directly out of a comic panel at times. But in terms of characterization, the movie barely explores who she actually is. So you end up with this strange situation where comic fans are simultaneously saying, she looks perfect, while also asking, why does she barely feel like a real character? Mystique is probably the most controversial adaptation decision overall, though. Because comic book Mystique and movie Mystique have become very different characters by this stage of the franchise. The films gradually transformed her from a morally slippery manipulator into this inspirational mutant icon, leading younger X-Men into battle. And whether audiences accepted that transformation mostly depended on how attached they were to the comic version. A lot of longtime fans never fully embraced it, not necessarily because Jennifer Lawrence was ineffective in the role, but because Mystique traditionally exists in a much murkier moral space. Positioning her as the emotional center of the heroic team felt strange to many readers familiar with the source material. And honestly, I understand both perspectives there. Cyclops is another character fans have always had complicated feelings about throughout these films overall. Many comic readers spent years waiting for the movies to fully embrace why Scott Summers matters so much within X-Men mythology. Apocalypse definitely improves the character compared to the original trilogy, but some viewers still felt the film never fully unlocked the confident strategic leader version of Cyclops they had been hoping to finally see. Then there are the timeline and continuity changes, which honestly become almost impossible to untangle at this point in the franchise. Characters appearing earlier than expected, relationships shifting around, ages no longer making sense, dead characters reappearing because timelines changed again. At a certain stage, Apocalypse basically starts operating on don't think about it too hard logic, which some audiences accepted while others absolutely rejected. And strangely, despite all those criticisms, I don't think most comic fans wanted the film to become a frame-by-frame adaptation either. That's important. Audiences usually accept changes if the emotional spirit of the characters still feels authentic. X-Men: Days of Future Past changed enormous amounts from the comics too, but emotionally it still captured why that storyline mattered. Apocalypse struggles more because some of its adaptation choices feel disconnected from the emotional identity longtime fans associate with these characters. Still, I do appreciate that the movie occasionally leans harder into comic book weirdness than earlier X-Men films ever did. The costumes become more colorful, powers become more exaggerated. Apocalypse himself is pure comic book insanity conceptually. Psychic battles, ancient mutant gods, the Four Horsemen, Weapon X sequences. This movie absolutely embraces the larger mythology side of X-Men. It just doesn't always know how to organize all those ideas into a satisfying adaptation. And honestly, that's probably why reactions from comic fans ended up so divided. Some appreciated finally seeing the franchise embrace more comic book spectacle. Others felt the movie captured the surface-level imagery of X-Men without fully understanding the emotional depth underneath those stories. So after everything, the Apocalypse storyline, the timeline confusion, the incredible Quicksilver sequence, the overloaded finale, Magneto's tragedy, the younger X-Men setup, all of it, where does X-Men? Apocalypse actually land? Honestly, it's one of the hardest X-Men movies to pin down emotionally, because this isn't a disaster in the same way something like X-Men Origins, Wolverine became a disaster. It's not completely broken. It's not embarrassing from beginning to end. There's far too much talent involved for that. Too many genuinely strong scenes. Too many moments where the movie suddenly clicks and reminds you why this franchise mattered in the first place. But at the same time, it never fully comes together either. And honestly, that's the frustrating part. Every time I revisit Apocalypse, I keep noticing the movie it could have been. A tighter version, a more focused version. A version that trusted its characters more than its destruction sequences. Because buried underneath this enormous overloaded blockbuster is a genuinely compelling X-Men story trying to break through. You see it in Magneto's arc. In Xavier refusing to abandon people. In younger mutants trying to discover identity and belonging. In Quicksilver's rescue sequence. In those brief quieter moments at the school where the movie finally slows down long enough to feel human again. Those scenes work, and honestly they work well enough that I can never fully dislike this movie, but then the film keeps drifting back toward excess. More digital spectacle, more mythology exposition, more world-ending stakes. More subplots competing for attention. Eventually, it becomes this strange blend of genuinely strong character material trapped inside a blockbuster that's trying far too hard to feel gigantic all the time. And maybe that's exactly why reactions to Apocalypse remained so divided over the years. Some viewers see a fun comic book spectacle with entertaining powers, strong action sequences, solid performances, and enough emotional material to stay engaging. Others see a bloated franchise sequel that lost the grounded emotional focus that made X-Men, First Class and X-Men, Days of Future Past resonate more deeply. And honestly, both perspectives make complete sense to me. Because depending on the scene, Apocalypse genuinely feels like both movies at different times. There are stretches where it's exciting, creative, emotionally invested, even slightly underrated. Then there are stretches where it feels exhausted by its own scale, drowning underneath digital destruction and overcrowded storytelling. The movie constantly swings between those two modes. Still, I'd rather watch an ambitious, messy superhero film than a completely lifeless one. And Apocalypse, for all its flaws, is never lifeless. It swings hard, sometimes far too hard, but at least there's energy behind it. Bryan Singer and the cast are clearly trying to turn this into a massive comic book event film, and even when it stumbles, you can feel the effort behind it. The movie genuinely wants to entertain you. It wants to impress you. It wants to feel mythic, emotional, and enormous simultaneously. It just never fully understands when to stop adding more. Looking back now, Apocalypse also feels strangely important for the franchise because it's where the cracks really started becoming visible. The timeline had become tangled. The emotional focus was drifting. The newer generation of mutants still hadn't fully taken ownership of the series, and the franchise itself seemed trapped somewhere between grounded character drama and giant superhero spectacle without fully mastering either side anymore. You can almost feel the series trying to reinvent itself in real time while simultaneously struggling against its own history. But even then, I still think there's enough here to revisit. Not because it's secretly a masterpiece audiences failed to understand. I don't think it is, but because it's a fascinatingly uneven film. A blockbuster filled with genuinely great moments sitting directly beside frustrating creative decisions. A movie that constantly flirts with greatness without ever fully reaching it. And honestly, that's probably the most accurate way to describe X-Men, Apocalypse overall, a genuinely good movie trapped inside an overcrowded one.